This is Writer's Mosaic in Conversation, and I'm Colin Grant. I'm going to be talking with the poet Jason Allen-Paisant about the Martinican poet Aimé Césaire, in particular about Césaire's poem Return to My Native Land, which was first published in 1939 and was reissued late last year. But I began by talking with Jason about his own collection, Self-Portrait as Othello, which Jason dedicated to those who inhabit the liminal space.
Those who live in multiplicity,
Yeah.
those who can't claim to be a singular self, not that any of us probably are, but some of us probably claim to be. But let's start that again. I think I'm referring to people who are always at the intersection of identities,
And
probably because of where they're from.
yeah.
I think the immigrant condition often lends itself to that because you're always between places. You have arrived here in Britain, in France, wherever you, but you're always still back there, somewhere else.
So Aimé Césaire would have been one of those people.
I think so. I was thinking about that when you were mentioning the reading out the quote, not thinking that you were directing it to me. But I don't know if Aimé Césaire would have. Hello, everybody, by the way. Good evening. It's nice to be here and to see the place filled out. It's really lovely. And to be celebrating this book. I don't know if Aimé Césaire would have characterized himself that way. I have a hunch that he might. He is somebody who left his native Martinique at the age of merely 17 years old. Came to Paris in 1931. Am I doing the maths right? He was born in 1913, arrived in Paris in
Yeah, that sounds about right.
1931 to be student at the Lycée Louis le Grand. Anybody familiar with the French system and the École préparatoire? It's this prestigious section or segment of a high school that prepares you for entry into what they call the Grande École, which are these prestigious, they're tertiary institutions, but they're like the Rolls Royce of tertiary institutions. And he ended up there in this, I would say, a condition of arrival, which is also a condition of shock. There was a lot to take on for the boy that he was coming from Martinique. There was a lot of learning. He was already a very bright person, but he began to go even deeper into the French literary canon and also other literary canons, because Césaire was a classicist. It's the classics that he one might say majored in. Certainly at the École Normale, his major thing was Latin and Greek, but he was also proficient in Italian. He mentions reading Dante in the Divine Comedy in the original, for example. He was a very hungry, intellectually hungry individual that embraced a multiplicity of influences and cultures, and it comes out in his writing. His interest for the worlds of ancient Greece, the classics, as I've said, his interest in African civilizations, Oriental civilizations.
Yeah. The reason why I'm looking at your book is because I've written down here that Return to My Native Land was published in 1939.
Yeah.
Right, because he was young then. Yeah.
Yeah, he was young.
Right.
How old would he have been?
26.
Yeah.
Wow. Impressive, because it's an autobiographical poem, isn't it? You better say yes to this.
It is. It is clearly autobiographical.
There's a big but there.
But it's not it's not like a confessional poem or, you know, like a strictly autobiographical poem. I think it
He doesn't
it's
name
loosely
himself.
connected. It's connected to his life, obviously, to the person he is. But
Sure. But it's following a man's journey from their homeland, Martinique, to Europe, to France, and discovering something about himself whilst he's there.
It's looking back at Martinique from Europe.
Okay.
I think it's fair to say that the poem really starts from Europe. Europe is the vantage point. We're probably going to talk about this anyway, but the moment at which he begins to write the poem was in 1935, in the summer of that year.
Okay.
He was in a city in then Yugoslavia on the Dalmatian coast. Anybody here speaks
Serbic?
it would be Croatian. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sibenik. How do we pronounce that? But that's where he was. He'd been invited there by a friend whom he'd met randomly in the streets in Paris. A guy, a bloke called Peter Guberinga. And Peter brought him home, and he was given a room, and the room overlooked the Adriatic Sea, and he saw an island. That's how he tells the story. And he said to Peter, "What a beautiful island! What's the name of it?" And the name of the place was Martinska, and the name immediately evoked Martinique to him. Martinska literally translates to the island of Saint Martin. But it was a moment of serendipity for him. It was the summer. It was beautiful. You know, I think it was gorgeous as well, and perhaps an association was made with the beauty of his country. Certainly, that was what set him off. A sense of coming to, we spoke about the name, but the serendipity of coming close to encounter his island, even though he's thousands of miles. He famously said that I didn't have any money to go back to Martinique, but I had enough money to come here, and I met Martinique here. So he started writing the poem. He started writing the poem in that room. The following morning, he said, he took his school notebook. Incidentally, in French, as you probably all know, the poem is called Notebook of a Return to My Native Land. So he wrote the first, pages of the notebook from Europe. And I think we get, I certainly get a sense of that in the opening pages. It's not like clearly said.
Sure.
But I get the feeling of the island looked at from a distance, probably like a great distance.
Well, in your introduction, you say about writers like him, something at an unconscious level pushes a West Indian artist like Césaire to go away from his birthplace in order to better understand the uncanny condition of the plantation society and the colonial system, which is still so present in everyday life of Martinique. That's what he was doing.
Yeah, that sort of thing.
And you couldn't do it by remaining in Martinique.
I don't know that you couldn't, but I think an entire generation of intellectuals felt that they couldn't. Let's just think about all the West Indian intellectuals from the post-war period who came to Britain or who came to France, who migrated because they thought that, I think it's a complex array of factors,
sure,
clearly.
Yeah.
But within that, I think is a sense of smallness.
Yeah. They want to get to the center, don't they?
They want to get to the center
Mm.
because they've also been educated to think that this is the center.
Yeah. And Césaire was educated to think that he was French,
Of
fully
course,
French.
of course,
Yeah.
of course. That's the French approach to colonization, assimilation.
Should we give the audience a little flavour of some of the writing? It's one of the pleasures of this book is that almost every line is a jewel. So can you have a little reading at the beginning?
At the end of the small hours, the rising wind of the past, of broken faith, of an undefined duty slipping away. And those other small hours, the early morning of Europe. To leave. As there are hyena men and panther men, so I shall be a Jew man, a Kafir man, a Hindu from Calcutta man, a man from Harlem who hasn't got the vote, famine man, curse man, torture man. You may seize him at any moment, beat him, kill him, yes, perfectly fine to kill him, accounting to no one, having to offer an excuse to no one. A Jew man, a pogrom man, a whelp, a beggar. But can you kill remorse with its beautiful face like that of an English lady stupefied at finding a Hottentot's skull in her soup tureen? I want to rediscover the secret of great speech and of great burning. I want to say storm. I want to say river. I want to say tornado. I want to say leaf. I want to say tree. I want to be soaked by every rainfall, moistened by every dew. As frenetic blood rolls on the slow current of the eye, I want to roll words like maddened horses, like new children, like clotted milk, like curfew, like traces of a temple, like precious stones buried deep enough to daunt all miners. The man who couldn't understand me couldn't understand the roaring of a tiger. Rise, phantoms, chemical blue from the forest of hunted beasts, of twisted machines, of jujube trees, of rotten flesh, of a basket of oysters, of eyes, of a lacework of lashes cut from the lovely sisal of human skin. I would have words huge enough to contain you all, and you too, stretched earth, drunken earth, earth great sex raised in the sun, earth, great delirium of the phallus of God. Earth, risen wild from the sea's locker with a bunch of cecrops in your mouth. Earth, whose surfing face I must compare to the mad and virgin forests that I would wish to wear as countenance before the undeciphering eyes of men. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So, you're Jamaican.
I am, yeah.
My parents are Jamaican. Well, I grew up in the capital of England, a place called Luton, and we didn't know many.
Were you born in Jamaica?
No, man, born here. Born here. But whenever my mother talked about people from Martinique or Guadeloupe, she'd say they were language people. And so they were foreign. They weren't known. What drew you to Aimé Césaire?
I studied him at university. He was on my syllabus in my second year, I think it was, of French. I did a major in French,
right,
for my undergraduate, and he was on the syllabus. We had to study him.
Okay. Well, a better question is, why are you still reading him for 20 years or more?
How could you stop reading someone like Aimé Césaire? You've heard the poem, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's quite a high standard for. I'm a poet, as everyone knows. It's something that you've got to absorb into your DNA as a poet. There are lots of things that you want to do that.
How do you do that?
You want to do that with?
How do you absorb another poet into your DNA?
Well, I read them over and over again. I memorize poetry as well. I think when you've got the lines in your head or in your body or wherever, you begin to somehow connect with the work in an intense way. It's there. It's there. It's something that you can draw upon.
Well, I'm interested in that because I write as well, but I'm wary of absorbing too many other writers' tone, voice. And so up to a point, I'll stop reading them. I don't want to hear Naipaul anymore. Thank you very much. Maybe he's not such an attractive character. Maybe that's why I don't want to hear him. But maybe I'm not as mature as you in terms of my kind of confidence about my writing. But I don't want myself to be too porous. But it sounds like you want to be porous and let these people in.
Well, that's how I've approached poetry. I think when I've also been taught like this. So
yeah,
it's what happens by chance, I suppose. I feel that no, I don't feel like my voice is contaminated. I think my voice is created by, forgive the food metaphor, but digesting, absorbing a whole range of voices. I think they chime with me and they resonate with things in my life, my affects, my experiences, and what's going to come out is always going to be I think as you grow as a writer, your unique alchemy is formed. And it's not necessarily an imitation of one particular person.
If you're at a dinner party, maybe with me, and you wanted, if I said to you, what kind of poet is he anyway? What kind of a poet is he?
Cosmic?
Cosmic. Because there's a line in the book, Return to My Native Land, where the protagonist says, I want to roll words like maddened horses. Is that a fair
Restless.
Restless horses, yeah.
No, maddened horses, but it makes me think of a restless lyricism. I'm not sure what I mean by that, but there's an intensity to the lyricism, and there is if I were to compare it to an element, I would say fire. I feel the desire of the poet for something, for an embrace, for the whole world, for feeling connected to the world, for feeling that his being is at ease within the world. I don't want it to sound abstract, like it's that questing desire. I think at the base of it is a lot of erudition. But how do you write the poem so that the erudition is worn lightly and it's not sort of browbeating or sort of heavy-handed? I think that's what Césaire manages to do. It's impelled by philosophy, but to say that is not to say that it's heavy-handed. He manages to carry that off through the lyricism. And how do you arrive at that as a poet? It's a question that I keep on asking myself. It's something perhaps undefinable, something that you can't sort of like logically pinpoint. But
it must have been a kind of crucible for him being in Paris in the 30s and meeting people like Senghor. So we mentioned in the beginning this notion of negritude. So for people who don't know what negritude is, one of the phrases that he coined for this movement, what is negritude and why did it come about?
Negritude is essentially a word for a cultural awakening, an awakening to Africa and its different worlds, to African wisdom, philosophy, culture, civilization, which seems probably commonplace to a lot of people today. But at the time, we're talking about the early 1930s, it was a huge moment to talk about the fact that Africa has a civilization or has civilizations, has thought and has history and that sort of a thing. That's what negritude comes down to, an awakening, an approach to art as well, that had to do with the embrace of African approaches to art that have been marginalized in Western, the Western history of art. He talks a lot about this concept called participation, which is the idea, according to him, this is how he puts it, that for the African artist, they participate in the object that they make. So African art is not just a distanced thing of creating something out there, and that your creative energies go in one direction. That the African conception of art is one in which you are transformed by the object that you quote unquote make. That was like a constant thread in his thought. So negritude is those two things. It's probably can be characterized in other ways as well, but ultimately it's what it comes down to. A salutary shock, a salutary shock about the worth of African culture and having a seat at the table of knowledge, of intellectualism, and of wisdom.
And would he have been influenced, because there are people at the time from the Caribbean, people like Claude Mackay, African Americans, it's the tail end of the Harlem Renaissance.
Yes, he was influenced by writers from the Harlem Renaissance. He wrote a short piece on Alain Locke in Tropique, which is a magazine that he co-edited with friends and colleagues from that period. He talks about encountering the work of Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and similar figures. That was a big deal for Césaire living in Paris in the 30s. And he talks a lot about what Senghor, the Senegalese poet Léopold Sédar Senghor, who was a student alongside him at the École Normale, what Senghor brought to him, this understanding of Africa. I mean, what are we talking about when we talk about this understanding of Africa? Perhaps it's clear, but let's spell it out. Africa was denigrated where Césaire came from. There were African heritage for the most part, but it was a place that you needed to distance yourself from, turn your back on. And it
was an embarrassment, wasn't it?
It was an embarrassment. It was below culture or subculture, sub everything. And here was Senghor, and in body. So it was the first time meeting Africans. I think that needs to be said. It was the first time and interacting with them. The literary salon that he attended in the mid to late 30s was influential in introducing him to African thought. It was a salon run by two Martinicans called Paulette Nardal and Jeanne Nardal. They were journalists and writers. And Césaire would go to their home. Quite a number of members of the African intelligentsia and the Black intelligentsia in Paris would frequent that literary salon. Those two figures are often marginalized, but they're very important figures as well in the space that they created for him as a young man, as a young student in Paris.
I wonder if you give us another reading that gives us a flavour of the kind of people that he's interacting with, not just literary people, but ordinary Black people in his journeying through Europe. Because one of the things that is kind of clear is that he inhabits other people's voices as well. You have lots of kind of quirky characters who pop up. And there's an old man that you're going to read about, aren't you?
Yeah, I think I chose this because I was thinking of how to give the audience a flavor of the different modes of the book.
Yeah.
Because
Because one important thing to say is that he divests himself of the Eurocentric view of life that he's been schooled in and has an ability to inhabit and express an Afrocentric view. Is that what we're trying to do?
in this passage that I'm about to read, he's doing something more intricate, I would say. But I'll read the passage before talking about that. Let me read these 2 pages, and then we can discuss that some more. And I who sang with clenched fist, you must be told the length to which I carried cowardice. In a tram one night, facing me, a Negro. He was a Negro tall as a pongo who tried to make himself very small on a tram seat. On that filthy tram seat, he tried to abandon his gigantic legs and his starved boxer's trembling hands. And everything had left him, was leaving him. His nose was like a peninsula off its moorings. Even his negritude was losing its color through the effects of a perpetual tanner's bleach. And the tanner was poverty. A great, sudden, long-eared bat whose claw marks on that face were scarred, scabby islands. Or perhaps poverty was a tireless workman fashioning some deformed cartridge. You could see clearly how the industrious, malevolent thumb had modeled a lump of the forehead, pierced 2 tunnels, parallel and disturbing, through the nose, drawn out the disproportion of the upper lip, and by a master stroke of caricature had planed, polished, varnished the smallest, neatest little ears in all creation. He was an ungainly Negro without rhythm or measure. A Negro whose eyes rolled with bloodshot weariness. A Negro without shame, and his big smelly toes sniggered in the deep gaping lair of his shoes. Poverty, it has to be said, had taken great pains to finish him off. She had hollowed the eye socket and painted it with a cosmetic of dust and rheum. She had stretched the empty space between the solid hinge of the jaws and the bone of an old, worn cheek. On this she had planted the shiny little bristles of several days' beard. She had maddened the heart and bent the back. And the whole thing added up to a perfectly hideous Negro. A peevish Negro, a melancholy Negro, a slumped Negro, hands folded as in prayer upon a knotty stick. A Negro shrouded in an old threadbare jacket. A Negro who was comical and ugly. And behind me, women giggled as they looked at him. He was comical and ugly, for a fact. I sported a great smile of complicity, my cowardice rediscovered. I bow to the 3 centuries which support my civil rights and my minimized blood. My heroism, what a joke. This town suits me to perfection. My soul is supine. Like this town, supine in the dirt and mud. This town, my face of mud. I demand for my face the dazzling prize of being spat upon.
Wow, thank you. I've met him. I've met characters like that, is what I mean. They're kind of broken, shipwrecked people who've come from elsewhere to the metropolis and they can't find a place for themselves and they're despised. And as a black person, sometimes you feel embarrassed to be in their company.
Yeah, but I think I hear you and I feel you. But the character who interests me most here is the speaker. I think they're the one that's performing a work on themselves, a kind of operation, a sort of surgery on themselves. I feel that work and the effort of it. I feel that deep vulnerability of self-examination. I feel that vulnerability to court shame, because there is a shame in what he's saying, because he's talking about being disdainful and being contempt, seeing this Negro through the eyes of contempt and not being able to see him through any other lens. And he's giving us that. I feel him giving us himself almost as a kind of rite of passage to be able to move to a different place. And we see that in the wake of this passage, because I realize that the tone of the poem immediately changes after this passage. We immediately begin to hear him using the word us, the pronoun us, and it becomes a we, and we get the line, our heart daily busts with meanness, and suddenly he is part of his people now. At the beginning of the poem, as I didn't read the exact beginning, but it is quite distanced. It's a distanced gaze. He's looking at these scenes of abjection. He's looking at the poverty of his people. He's looking at Martinique as a place of muteness. All of this muteness accumulated in the body through centuries and centuries of colonial violence. And all of that amounts to something of sadness and a sort of contempt or near contempt. And suddenly, after this passage, he gradually, and as I said, there's something that immediately happens. But what you get after this passage is a gradual moving into viewing his people through the lens of grace, a sort of grace with which he's able to see everything and his people and the possibility of a different future, the possibility of a different way of seeing, which is really, really important. The question of what can poetry do? And what am I and what can I do as a poet? And we know, of course, that he would go on to become a politician and a politician poet. He was very much a politician who spoke poetry from the lectern, from the stages. It's very rare. You can, if we had time, we could talk to you, give you extracts of some of his speeches, which you wouldn't hear a politician talking like that today. But it's so. I wanted to read this scene because I find it uncomfortable sometimes to read. And even reading it just now to a crowd, I feel it's a mix of things, am I seeing myself a little bit, in that Negro? It's a very uncomfortable thing. But he has to enter into that gaze to liberate himself from it. The line that says he was comical and ugly is written in bold, is written in caps. He was comical and ugly for a fact.
But it moves from disdain to empathy.
Yes.
And see that this character is a candidate for compassion.
Yes. And what it is to address one's complicity.
Well, listen, I'd like to ask you all to put your hands together to thank Jason Allen-Paisant.
Thank you.
Thank you, Penguin, for reissuing this. And I think it's a valuable tool for understanding how someone can evolve from being considered himself a Frenchman and someone who's maybe despises or is unsure about his African ancestry to move and evolve, become a person that's more holistic. And I think you heard today, I think Jason wrestling with that idea of this evolution of this poet in the making. So thanks very much, Jason, and thanks very much the London Review Bookshop. I was in conversation with Jason Allen-Paisant. To hear more writers, go to writersmosaic.org.uk.